So it's the next day right now. As you just saw in the video, probably I finished disassembling the entire organ yesterday. And the first thing I would like to tackle today are these pedals, which I want to transform into like a Moog Taurus Midi bass pedal switch system type unit, similar to the one Geddy Lee famously uses or used to use on stage, and other people as well, just him, but oh well. I want to do it without actually coding anything because I suck at it and it's just very difficult for me. Not that I don't want to learn more about it, but right now I can't be bothered. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using one of these. A Makey board. This is a Makey board, which I can plug into my computer and it will instantly be recognized as a keyboard and or a mouse without having to code anything or having to download and import all these libraries and stuff, which is really cool. And I know you might be wondering now, well, if the pedals will be registered as keystrokes like a regular keyboard, how can you use it as a MIDI device? And for that, I've got some software called ControllerMate, which is a macro software, I think they refer to it as, which lets me translate these keystrokes from specifically this keyboard, not my main keyboard, to MIDI messages, which then Pro Tools or whatever DAW you might use can read instantly. And yeah, that basically lets you do the same thing as if you were to use an Arduino, but without having to do loads of difficult coding. There is, however, one big problem which I ran into, which is that this bass pedal switch system, unlike most others I've seen online, doesn't have hardwire switches inside the pedals themselves, if that makes sense. So a lot of these units will have two wires coming out per pedal, and you can easily wire it to whatever you're using to process the signal coming from the pedals. In this case, there's a matrix board which was attached here with these rubbery button things in between them. It's kind of similar to a computer keyboard, like a USB keyboard you'd use for typing today. And I actually did figure out the matrix by tracing the lines, but because of the inherent design and problems that do come with the Makey, which is that there's one ground, so everything that's connected to the ground or the earth here, which I guess you can see as the return input, goes to the same source. And because of these transistors, I believe, on here, the signal can only flow from here to there, which means that I have a limited number of keys I can assign to every pedal, and that would mean that I can't have enough individual pitches to have, you know, the full octave of this bass pedal. So that sucks, but as a solution, I have these momentary contact switches here. And with a washer, I think I can screw these in the holes where the rubbery buttons used to be. And if I then wire those to the Makey, I will be able to get a different key, if you like, on every pedal, because it can flow both ways. And with this thing, I think the current can only flow one way instead of two ways, so it makes sense. So yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna crack on and I'll show you what it looks like. If it's kind of vague now because my description might be a bit vague, but you'll see what I mean, I guess. But if you do this as well at home, it is more than likely that you'll have one with like wires coming out of the pedals, so you won't have to worry about this. So the first thing I did was I removed the little felt feet and the metal bracket that was holding the pedals in place so I could get to the actual holes. I actually ordered some different momentary contact switches because the ones I just showed you were a bit small. I didn't actually end up using the washers and the nuts because the thread of the actual switch didn't extend all the way to the bottom of the base plate of the switch, if that makes sense. So I couldn't get it to screw in tightly, so I actually glued it, which worked fine as well. So here you can see the switch is glued. I actually used two types of glue, a pretty strong glue and some hot glue to keep them in place whilst the strong glue, which was on the bottom side, dried. And here you can see me putting the little felt feet and metal bracket thing on again. So now that I've glued the buttons in place, I'm going to be using my laptop and the Makey board to quickly check if they're all working, because otherwise I have to take them out and fix whatever potential problem might be preventing them from working correctly. But they're literally just on-off, like momentary contact button switches things, so it should be fine. So yeah, I'm going to quickly do that, and then I can move on to soldering the switches. I actually used 2 different colors for the wiring so that I could keep track of which switch had already been wired to the ground under the key input later, so I couldn't accidentally wire a switch to go to the ground twice, if that makes sense. They're not completing the circuit and not working, essentially. So to prevent certain issues with regards to triggering things, because certain keys might be fast keys and things in certain softwares, you can actually reprogram what keys the Makey triggers without actually having to code anything. You can just go to the Makey website and follow the instructions there. So instead of making a custom housing for the pedals, I just realized that I can repurpose the stool that came with the organ. And if I cut the top off, the bottom kind of stand bit kind of makes the perfect housing for this. I'll have to cover it, the top side anyway, but yeah, the legs and everything are done, and I can actually mount it to the support beam thing that sits in the middle. And that way the pedals will actually be slightly above the ground surface, which means there will be room and space for the pedals to travel when you press them. So that's perfect, so I'm gonna use that. So it might seem like overkill, but I added those little brackets because the keys are actually floating, because there needs to be some room and space for the keys to travel when you press them down with your foot. And that meant that it's kind of wiggling when you press it, so it wasn't actually necessarily going to come out, but I just didn't want it to move. So here you can see me unpacking and wrapping some items that I ordered. Halfway through the build, I figured it would be cool to have light bulbs on top of the actual unit and to make the housing out of sheet metal. So as you can see here, the Makey has 2 output pins, which puts out 5 volts whenever a key or a mouse input is registered. And if you then use a relay, you can actually use it to turn off and on actual powered machines or light bulbs that actually use mains level voltage and current. I thought it would be cool to add some like grippy sandpaper tape to the sides to make it more robust looking, and I also glued some LED strip to the kind of lower area, which will later be partially covered by the sheet metal. So you get a kind of red or whatever color you decided to be glow over the key, so you can actually kind of see what you're doing. This LED strip won't actually be triggered by the relay, but the bulbs later on will be. As you can see me here finding out, it's actually incredibly hard to bend sheet metal, especially if it's rather thick. I ordered, I think it was 0.5 mil, but whatever you have, it's gonna be pretty hard to bend sheet metal without tools. So just a heads up, if you are thinking of using sheet metal, you might want to get really thin sheet metal, or you might want to get some tools to actually bend it with, because it's pretty impossible to do it by hand.
In the end, a combination of brute force and a lot of patience allowed me to bend it enough to then actually drill holes into it and to then put screws through the holes, which then essentially kept it in place. So it looks, pretty DIY hand done, but it is actually, the right shape. So yeah, again, make sure you get thin sheet metal, or maybe ask someone who has tools to help you for like metal bending and stuff, because it's pretty hard to do. So here I'm soldering some wires to the makey in and outputs, which is easier to do when it's not inside whatever you're putting it in yet. This is actually an older board which I had lying around, which I used for something before, which was somewhat faulty. So I actually decided to use a newer board. Actually, the board I used was a cheap Chinese makey copy. So the one on the left is actually the one that went into the actual unit, but they're both identical in the way they work. That is the relay I used. You just saw a bigger relay on the side, which I was going to use, but then I realized because the makey has only 2 outputs, I wasn't able to control every single pedal and every single bulb individually with the makey. I needed something else for that, but because I was using the makey, I decided to just have it so that whenever a key is pressed, all the light bulbs turn on. And because it's a bass pedal anyway, I figured it would be better, because you don't really tend to play chords unless you have like 8 feet, because you have to stand and balance and then play chords. So yeah, I figured it would be better this way anyway, because then at least you can see the bulbs lighting up together instead of only one bulb being on at a time. So that same day, actually, my family came over from the Netherlands. I live in Brighton in the UK, because it was my birthday, and I was actually kind of preoccupied with building the thing, because I don't really care for birthdays. Although it was very nice of them to come over, so they were waiting for me to finish something before we actually headed out to eat somewhere. So yeah. Shake me up and let the colors run. So here you can see me screwing one of those little electricity terminal divider block thingies into the side of the actual unit. So then from there I could attach anything that needed power on the inside to that, and that would go to the mains. I actually broke open the plug adapter thing for the LED strips, so I could actually mount it inside the unit. Otherwise there would have been 2 power plugs sticking out of the back instead of 1. Here's a quick shot of the table, which is a huge mess. And I'm just using some shrinky, tubey stuff here to make sure the cables stay in place, which I'm shrinking using a lighter. And here you can see me just quickly testing if the keys are actually registering, if the input works, which it does because the little LED's lighting up. And here I'm actually attaching a wire to these bulb sockets before putting them in, because again it's easier to do before you put something inside of something, which requires you to work within a confined space, which is not the most efficient way of working.
She doesn't want to stay. I've been running around. Keep running to keep me from coming down.
And here I'm using a tape measure and some tape to kind of roughly mark out a straight line and to see where I would drill the holes for the light bulbs.
So I haven't actually talked that much or filmed myself talking that much, which I think I say in every single video. But it is the truth, because it's kind of hard to film yourself and talk whilst you're actually trying to do something. But I'll quickly show you what I have so far. It's literally almost done. I only have to widen the holes of the cover, the aluminium plate metal cover thing for these bulbs to fit through, and I just attached them to the system and I tried it out and they work. So whenever you press the pedal they light up. So I only have to enlarge the holes now. I was initially gonna have the 16 channel relay, which would allow me to independently turn on each bolt, which would allow me to turn on each bulb independently, but because of the Makey, which only has 2 outputs, I wasn't able to do that. I thought I would be, but that hack didn't seem to work for me. So now any key triggers all the bulbs, and I thought because it's a foot pedal anyway, you wouldn't really play many keys together anyway, so it would be a bit boring to only have one bulb light up. So essentially the signal from the Makey here goes to the relay, and that turns on the lights whenever a key is pressed. So I'm gonna drill those holes now and mount the bulbs, and then check out the final product, and also show you how I'm actually making it send MIDI messages within the computer using controller mate.
So the holes at this point are obviously not big enough to put the light bulb sockets through, so I actually had to buy a special drill bit, which is really big and really expensive, but I guess, you know, I'll be using it in the future, so it wasn't a bad purchase. But yeah, it was like 30-40 pounds just to get that drill bit, but I didn't have anything else that was big / wide enough to actually make the holes.
It doesn't matter if it's blue, it's not the blues. It doesn't matter if it's blue, it's not the blues. It's not gonna happen if we don't list. So what's it gonna matter if we start this beginning? In heaven's garden we stand. This is Nirvana again.
So now that's done, I can finally start tidying and cleaning all this stuff, because the table is kind of one huge chaotic pile of shit currently, so that's going to be thoroughly enjoyable to sort out. But I'm not going to film that because no one cares about that, because videos are just about showing the 1% of the good stuff and then basically skipping everything that's actually hard in between. It's life. Bye. So, as you can tell and see, it's done. Whenever I press a key, it lights up, or a pedal, I guess, which is pretty cool. And these are LED bulbs, by the way, so they don't consume a lot of power, so that should be a good thing. Anyway, I'll show you now how I actually get it to show up as a MIDI device within your DAW, or whatever you're using to trigger like sounds or samples, because obviously the Makey board, as I mentioned before, is seen as a mouse/USB keyboard. At least your computer sees it as one of those. So I'm using ControllerMate, which is a program which lets you do stuff, and it's great. And I think the type of software that ControllerMate kind of falls under, like the bracket it's in, is like macro whatever type software, or macro controlling software. So essentially, anyway, there's other stuff you could use to achieve the same thing, but I'll show you how I did it now. I was even thinking in the future I could hook it up to, give me a second. So I was thinking that in the future I could use the MIDI output from this thing, which is like a pedal switcher system, and I could send it to the computer, and then possibly using ControllerMate I could get it to change the outputs, channels and nodes and stuff, this outputs through ControllerMate. So say if I switched the bank or the preset for a different song in a live set, this would then potentially automatically change. At least in ControllerMate, the outputs could change something. I think it should be possible because there are both MIDI in and output building blocks within the software. So that's something I have to experiment with, but that's just an idea. But yeah, essentially, I'll show you now how I did it, and I'm thinking in the future, just because it's easier, I might actually change the code on the Makey, which I think it's possible, like with a regular Arduino board, even though I hate coding. Well, I don't hate it, but I just suck at it, because it's a little easier, because that means I don't have to have ControllerMate running in the background. But for now this works fine, so yeah, I'll show you how I did it now.
Oh yeah.
So here we go. Let me just turn on the screen recording. So I'm gonna show you now. I guess I'm gonna make myself tiny and put myself in the corner. Probably the right top corner, but maybe the top left corner, I don't know. Maybe the bottom left corner, or the bottom right corner, or in the middle. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, here we go. So here you can see the programming page that I created in ControllerMate, which has all of the input keys and all of the notes that it produces. Firstly, you want to make sure by going into preferences that you've got the MIDI virtual outputs section switched on, which it is, and you can select and create different outputs. In my case, I'm going with the default ControllerMate titled outputs, I guess. You can create different blocks and inputs and whatever. So in my case, I've got the Makey, which I think is this I/O board. You can actually check this by pressing the button or switch or whatever you're using, and it will light up. And it should actually, if I click on it, show me the actual button, the corresponding button of each key, or in this case pedal, when you press it. So in this case, if I drag this to here, I can then go to the output MIDI section here and select the MIDI notes, then drag this output to this input, and here you can see, okay, it's gonna be the ControllerMate channel 1, and the note is C5. So this is just, if you don't know much about music, I guess, then you might be like, why are there so many different C's or D's or whatever? It has to do with that these are essentially a lower pitch, because there's a middle C and everything under and above that. So anyway, there's some other variables here that you can change if you'd like to, which might be convenient or not, depending on what you're doing. But yeah, this is essentially all you have to do I did it for all 13 keys, so I'm gonna disable this, go back to here, that's all set up, and now I'm gonna go to my DAW, and it's important actually when you're in your DAW, oh yeah, the camera is still recording, we've got 4%, we have to hurry up. When you're in your DAW, you have to go to Midi and actually select the input device, otherwise it won't work and or show up. In this case, controller mates. So once that's all done, it should work and it will trigger whatever you've set it to trigger. There's one thing that might be worth mentioning is that in settings in controller mate, I think you can select certain inputs or input devices to only work when certain windows are open, I believe, which means that it won't mess up other things, and even if it does, like say if your DAW's open and it will actually think, oh, the keyboard is typing D as well as receiving the MIDI note that you've selected it to produce when the key is pressed. You could just click your desktop or minimize the window, because then whatever you're pressing isn't messing with the DAW setting and it will still work, if that makes sense. Because I guess if your DAW is set to do something when the letter S is pressed, it will still see it happening like as an activity or an input, like the A or D or whatever being pressed next to receiving a MIDI note. It doesn't know it's the same thing. It still sees it as a keyboard, if that makes sense. So yeah, just make sure maybe your DAW is minimized. Again, you could potentially fix this by just uploading code that makes it into a MIDI output device anyway, or again by minimizing your window. It is also a good thing to say that your main keyboard won't produce any MIDI information because it is specific to this input controller, as you saw in the in the controller made software earlier. It is only receiving from this thing and then turning that into MIDI. So yeah, anyway, kind of sounds like this song. Or anything you wanted to do or sound like, you could make it sound like. This kind of reminds me of the intro to Tom Sawyer. So thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe and all that stuff if you've enjoyed it. There will be other episodes, and I will actually be doing a lot of stuff with the other parts and even the outer shell of the organ itself. So stay posted and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. I've got this organ thing here, and now when I press a key, nothing happens. Okay.